Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for one event in our Conversations series. So what we're doing in these conversations is I am Apter Bairnsfather. I'm director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, and I am bringing conversations that I get to have usually behind the scenes to light so that everyone can learn from the amazing people that I get to talk to in my role. So you may know that the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh is deeply engaged with communities throughout the city of Pittsburgh and the region of southwestern Pennsylvania. Our guest today is Betty Cruz. Betty assumed the role of president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh in January of 2020. Prior to joining the council, Betty served as the leader of Change Agency, a social enterprise which she founded in 2016, and project director for All, an immigrant inclusion initiative. She's developed citywide initiatives for Pittsburgh Mayor William Peduto, managed major accounts for a national nonprofit dedicated to building playgrounds across the U.S., and supported public relations for global brands representing a wide range of industries. Originally from Miami, Florida, Betty is the daughter of Cuban immigrants and a first-generation college graduate. Betty, thank you so much for being with us today. Let's get into our conversation.
Thanks for having me, Lauren. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. And I'll just start by, for context, telling everyone that the Holocaust Center worked very hard to plan a large event that was to be held at the August Wilson Center on April 5th. And it was in the context of building relationships and meeting people around town that we first met very soon after you began your role with World Affairs Council. And not long after that, we were all in quarantine. So I'm imagining you've had quite a first 6 months under these conditions, and I'm just excited to hear what you've been up to and how you've responded to these strange circumstances. But first, I was really taken in your biography that you were a first-generation college student, because that's a very interesting thing to talk about. And I'm just wanting to hear from you about what that experience was like, where your family comes from too, how your family responded to your going to college.
Yeah, it's a really important part of my identity. I'm very proud of it. It was a long road to get there. And so my parents are born in Cuba. My brother was born in Cuba, and we left a lot of family behind in the early 70s when they left from Cuba to Madrid and then ultimately landed in Miami, which is where I was born. But my mom didn't finish school. She has about 6th, 7th grade level of schooling that she went through. And then my dad went through about high school level, but at the same time, he was, when he was 12 years old, he was working in a bakery to help his family. So it's a different world. It's a different life. And they worked very hard from the moment they arrived in this country to ensure that we would have bigger and better opportunities than they ever dreamed of for themselves, and certainly ever lived for themselves. And they never, contrary, I think a lot of times the immigrant children narrative is that you get pushed, and to be a doctor, to do all of these other things. And my parents just wanted me to have a better life than they did. They just wanted more opportunity. And they've always said, we don't care what career you choose, just be the best at it, work your hardest. And they proved day in and day out with, 6 days a week, 12 to 15 hour long days in their small Cuban restaurant that they had. They proved that hard work was fundamental and important to them. It did not come easy, and they definitely did not want me to go into the restaurant industry. I'll tell you that because of all of the work that they put in there. But I think that the challenge with that, when I say, that part of the immigrant story, that narrative where you have folks who aren't arriving with a legacy of degrees or wealth that has been accumulated, which might be the story for some, but certainly wasn't the story for my family. The they were supportive of me, but there's only so much they could do when I, came home from school. When I came home from school, they were still working. So I had actually one of our neighbors down the street basically took me in as an extension of her family. And I call her to this day my grandmother, and they're Brazilian. So I grew up actually with this multicultural identity, both my Cuban roots, but then a whole other new family that was from Brazil and also Portugal that shaped me a lot as well. But when it comes to, my first language was Spanish. That's what we spoke at home. I also then was speaking Portuguese, and all in that process, the schooling part was really on me. And it's a really complicated story to talk about because my brother's journey was different. He was a top performer in his school. He figured it out, right? He figured it out. He was in advanced classes, and for a variety of reasons, he did go to college for his first semester, and for a variety of reasons decided not to continue on in that, and has made a career for himself in his chosen industry, and that's been great. I similarly did go to college right after high school. I went to community college in Miami, and I was not the high performer that he was. I was, more introverted and just wasn't prepared for studying. Didn't really have that similar academic conviction that my brother did. Same family, different initial experiences. So I say all of that to just say that sometimes we talk about the immigrant journey and think that it's one path, and it's actually even within the same family can look different ways. In the end, I did go to that first couple of semesters of community college, and I just, again, was not ready, and decided to start working and do that hard work that my parents instilled in us and just get to work. And that I was always ready for. I was always up to the challenge to make the effort, and professionally, and hungry for that. And I was able to cut my teeth in and worked for a couple different publishing companies, and then worked in public relations for a number of years, and loved writing. And eventually in that journey realized that there was a path for me should I choose it and want to grow in this industry. But at the end of the day, I was hoping to find something that connected to my soul, to my passion. And it was through these different professional experiences that I realized, if you really want to do something that fills your heart, you're going to have to go back to school. And I was finally ready in my late 20s. After a long winding road, I went back to school, and at the age of 30 was the first in my family to graduate from college. And then I didn't stop going. Then I went on to get my master's immediately after. And these have all been really incredibly transformative experiences in my life. And I think it's important to talk about it because for many, the first generation college experience, like I said, my brother he was the high performer and went to college and chose not to continue it. That path is really, really hard when you're a first generation college student. That like learning the ropes of how you study for exams, how you find your community. It's really, really hard. And I'm proud to be the first in my family.
It's awesome. And thank you for sharing all of that with us. My mother is the first in her father's family. So she also had that experience. Yeah. And but it resonates with me, what happens with first generation students, because I worked at a university for a very long time. It's far from my own experience, but I saw it, and I have an understanding of how difficult it is. And I've seen universities work to put resources in place. I feel like this is a good fit with everything we're here to talk about today, which, we're talking about immigrants. We're also talking about diversity. We're talking about how to be an anti-racist organization. This is one of the things that universities continue to struggle with. How can universities be welcoming places for all of the students who are going to show up there ready to study and ready to learn? But I also just want to reflect on the importance of recognizing when it's not the right time, because there's so much pressure in our culture to go straight to college, which is not the right thing for a lot of people. And it's not a judgment, and it's not a criticism. It's just saying that, when you're ready, you're ready. And if you're not, it can be a very painful experience, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, there's, um, going from humble roots to that experience where you're then surrounded with folks who just have different backgrounds, where you don't see yourself sometimes among your peers. Their experiences, what they've had access to, looks very different than yours. Even when I went to grad school at Pitt, which another chapter in my life that I'm also very proud of. And so then I should say my undergrad is from Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania, also proud of that. And but when I went to Pitt, to Gispia, we didn't even have a Latino student group, right? So there were definitely many international students from all around the globe. But in terms of finding your community, finding your tribe, finding people who have had different paths than what might be the perceived norm, can feel isolating and intimidating. I'll say candidly, the day that I decided to stop going to my college classes when I was straight out of high school, I almost had a bit of a panic attack. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can't do this. And that's real. And we need to talk about these realities and not send these messages that it's easy or that there is a perfect singular path, because there isn't.
I'm grateful to you for being so open about that. And I'm just a very traditional, went to college, loved it, went to grad school. I had a very privileged education experience, especially in higher ed. And it also gives me an opportunity to see that it's not that way for most people.
Yeah. The other thing you mentioned, your upbringing and what might be privileged about that. Well, that's the other part of my identity that I now grapple with, right? Now I am this privileged person because I have these other new experiences that now are just another piece of the pie that make me who I am. But I also have to recognize that reality and duality.
It's hard. And I feel like we've come very far in being able to have this conversation and see where we're positioned, really, like see the ways that we are privileged, which doesn't mean that it's been easy. And for you, I mean, different kind of story, really. I mean, just going home and your parents are working. I saw in your bio that you're fluent in Spanish and Portuguese. Is it from your early childhood with your parents and this other family from Brazil?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they are my grandparents. And so we would speak. It wasn't until college that I actually took Portuguese classes. But so my Spanish, it was always a version of like Portuñol, where you speak a little Portuguese, a little Spanish, and then just throw in some English, mishmash. But yeah, it was from those two worlds. We were just a couple blocks away. But my grandparents and their culture and their language and my parents.
And there's so much richness to that, as you know, in this country, we so rarely learn languages other than English, which gets me to thinking about Pittsburgh now and immigrant communities in Pittsburgh and immigrant inclusion, which is something that you've worked on. Can you just tell us about the landscape? I mean, who is here? What exists for them? I mentioned that we had an exhibit that was bilingual, a traveling exhibit in Spanish and English, and no one understood why we had an exhibit in Spanish. I lived 20 years nearly in Texas. Like, of course it's in Spanish, but that's not the scene in Pittsburgh, basically, is what I'm getting at. So, please, if you would tell us.
Yeah, sure. So the challenge here is that it's a few things. The reality is that Pittsburgh, bled out a significant part of its population with the collapse of the steel industry. So we missed waves of migration that other cities had. So where other cities could not just feel the influx and the benefit and the vibrancy that comes with the waves of Latino migration and of immigrants coming from all around the world, Pittsburgh didn't see that in the same way as we look through its history of when migration was shaping our country in most recent years. And when you think of that gap from the collapse of the steel industry to today, that's a significant chunk of time. But there weren't the economic industry, the economic opportunity here wasn't such that even the immigrants who did first land here, we did have a Vietnamese community, for example, that was resettled here, but in large part did not stick because at the end of the day, the first thing you need is to be able to set roots, right? And to set roots, you need a job, and you need to find a home and find your fundamentals. And when our economic industry was changing so quickly and was so challenged, that was a significant barrier. That being said, there are folks that came here. There are immigrants who came here. In large part, throughout those years, we saw folks coming to be professors, so academics and the medical and healthcare field. And we have community members who have set roots here for decades and who are Pittsburghers. The other factor at play, though, is that our topography just lends itself for us to be even more segregated than is already the way America segregates, which is problematic in and of itself. And when you add our topography that certainly has its beauty, that we all benefit from, it has the challenges it creates where it literally disconnects communities from one another. And we know how we say folks won't cross bridges, but folks sometimes won't even cross over a couple of neighborhoods. And that's the reality. And therefore what ends up happening is you don't see the very people who are here now. Right? So we do have a large Indian community that has been here for years and years and years. In terms of recent waves of migration, our most recent refugee communities that are the largest ones, I would say, is our Bhutanese refugee community. And the last I had heard from the community, we were looking at about 10,000 or so who have resettled in the Pittsburgh area. And these are individuals that there was about 2,000 initially, 1,500 to 2,000 that were directly resettled in Pittsburgh. But what ends up happening is that they share with their cousins or friends living in other parts of the U.S., share a picture. There is a story of one gentleman, he's a leader in the community, who was living in New York. He had been resettled there, and someone showed him a picture of Mount Washington. And he said, "That looks like home. I'm going there." And he relocated from New York to Pittsburgh. Other reasons are, I found a job. In Pittsburgh, you can find the job, you can buy a house. So those things do lend itself to then what we now have today, which is a growing community of former refugees from Bhutan. We have a Somali Bantu community as well. The Latino community has grown significantly. The challenge that when we look at that, immigration history from the fall of the steel industry to today, predominantly for a large time, and even now, we're at the top of the list as it relates to what they call high-skilled immigrants. But we're at the bottom of the list still in terms of just how many folks are here altogether. So it's a small community, but it's growing. It's grown rapidly in recent years. And what I think is most interesting, and you'll see the bias as it ties to my own roots, is that we're seeing more diversity in economic and just our entire background experience of the immigrants who are arriving today. So yes, we want to have our academics and our professors and our healthcare professionals and innovation folks, technology and industry around engineer and others. And the reason that today in Pittsburgh, you see our main streets bustling in a way that that you didn't even 10 years ago is because of our changing and growing immigrant community. You can see that along Squirrel Hill with a number of French, Asian, Latino restaurants, you name it. You can see it in how Beachview has been transformed predominantly by the Latino community there. So we have residents here. We have Pittsburghers who are immigrants, both who have been here for decades and decades and those who have arrived in recent years.
It's interesting to think about these reverberations of the collapse of the steel industry, which at this point is 40 years ago, and what that's meant for the region. But when you talk about how segregated we are by topography and by neighborhood, I wonder, and you might be able to give us some insight here, what is the immigrant experience like? Is it a welcoming city?
My personal take on it is that we aspire to be welcoming. We hear that from many of our elected leaders, and that's important. And that hasn't always happened. That, I would say, actually has not previously happened until our recent elected leaders. The mayor, Mayor Peduto, made it an early part of his platform and of his initiatives, launched straight out the door in 2014, which I had the privilege, the benefit to work on. And the county executive has also made important comments in recognizing that the immigrant community not only contributes to our economy, so not only is it smart for Pittsburgh to be welcoming and for the Pittsburgh region to be welcoming, it's also the right thing to do for so many reasons. That said, I think one of the biggest challenges for Pittsburgh has been that, and one of the parts why I think that history is so important to speak to, is that when you have so many folks leaving and leaving and leaving, there is an insularity that is created in this process where you're not experiencing newcomers or connecting with those folks who are already here, be it the Black American community or the other immigrant communities that were here. So that insularity just fans these ideas and these tendencies to only look inward, and that has a ripple effect in how we engage with the world and how welcoming we truly are. And I think to be truly welcoming means that folks have a seat at the table. There is a sense of belonging. There is opportunity. So it's not enough to just be nice. I think Pittsburgh is a very friendly place. Friendly and welcoming are not the same thing. So it's one thing to wave to your neighbor, or to cross paths with someone and extend the smile. That's important, and we should all do that, and that goes a long way, and that's a first step. But it's not enough if you're not also hiring from these communities, taking an intentional step to recognize their value and their worth and to prioritize them in your own, wherever you can, wherever you have power. If you're an employer, in your place of worship, wherever you can, there are things that take it beyond being friendly to being truly welcoming.
It feels so important to me to be talking about this now. A lot of the conversations we're recording are with leaders in Black communities, and it's really important that the Holocaust Center have those conversations. But when we talk about Black, white, or include Jewish, which complicates things a little bit, we're still not talking about this whole segment of our population that, I don't want us to leave out, because I think that what you describe as insularity is exactly right. And it's my experience of growing up in this area that we were very insular to the people we already knew, to the people who were like us, not in any cruel kind of way, but in the way that that's how it was, which is just such an important thing to understand, I think, as we look at all these weeks and weeks of protests for Black Lives Matter now. And that is juxtaposed with COVID and its disproportionate health outcomes. I mean, this is the moment where we really can talk about this. And I think we can move the needle. I'm wary of who still gets left out when we're thinking about this. So, I mean, this is why I wanted us to talk about the immigrant communities in Pittsburgh and how immigrants are included and excluded still from the things that we're talking about. And I very much value your perspective and now your leadership of the World Affairs Council. So in our first meeting, which we didn't see what has come to pass coming, although it was pretty soon before we went on lockdown, it was at the Holocaust Center. We were talking about our organization. So Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh is a 40-year-old organization. And I know World Affairs Council has been around for even longer. So if you could tell us a bit about what you found when you got there, and we'll get into some of the things that you've done publicly to bring change to that organization. But just, tell people about it. It's been around a long time and has many, many devoted adherents, but let's hear about it.
Sure, sure. So the World Affairs Council has been around for almost 90 years. So next year, 2021, we turn 90. And our mission has been to provide a pathway for a more globally minded region. Typically, we're doing that in the classroom with high school students primarily, also working with teachers, and in the community through our public programming, all with the intent to create a learning space that covers key international issues. What I was really excited about when looking at my personal journey, and roots, as well as the more recent work that I was able to do, as we were talking about with around immigrant inclusion, is how we can. So I think education is the heart of everything. If we cannot have honest conversations about the world and the state of the world and facts and how the state of our planet and climate change and what is real and what is fake and what are our individual responsibilities as well as governmental responsibilities to learn and do. Without that education and that coming together, that gathering to learn and share and reflect and talk about an issue and then move it to action, we'll just continue to spin our wheels. Or it'll be just an academic exercise where you can talk about something, but it might only be limited to a few that have access to these spaces and places, and then everyone goes home and our life goes on, right? What I was most excited about is how we can take the legacy of this organization that has been around for so long. I mean, 50 years alone, we've been doing this youth education work. So even that part of our history is long and storied and has had great impact. How can we accelerate that change? How can we accelerate what we're already doing in schools and the way that we're working with the community and with subject matter experts to turn up the dial and say, how do we take the platform that we have, the way that we can bring people together and be a convener, and what's the next step that needs to happen to lead to actual meaningful change, to lead to action. And for me, in order to see that leap take place, we really need to break down any barriers that we're seeing in our programming. So it was important to make sure that our programming is more accessible, that it's something that folks can participate in, whatever their background might be, whatever their career might be, their economic opportunity might be, and for folks to know that we exist. And the reality is that what we were finding is that when you have in-person only programs at a certain time of day, by design, you're actually excluding a large segment of the population. And whether that's the intent or not, that's what happens. So my goal from day one was how do we flip the table on all of that? How do we make it more accessible? How do we bring the programming to the people, to the community, and to the students as well? Because we were seeing this mirrored in our youth programming. Also, amazing stories of impact, oftentimes reaching our youth who were already plugged in some way, already part of Model UN, or already connected to some type of a peer group. What about the rest of us, like myself, that lost student who just wasn't ready and would have loved to maybe have found those inroads early on, but I wasn't part of those groups. How do we make sure that those young people have access to connect to what's happening in this world, so they understand not just the world around them, but their place in the world? So that's kind of the big picture drive and goal that I was coming in with already. The reality is that COVID just accelerated everything. And in some ways good. In some ways we needed to step a little bit more into the 21st century as it relates to technology and as it relates to access, and a number of other issues. And in some ways, certainly we would rather not be in the middle of a global health pandemic where education is being challenged in such a way. So now we're faced with the charge of how are we, yes, the World Affairs Council, but we as community members who have a vested interest in our future being our children and also our collective future, how are we going to reimagine education? And I think that that's what this pause, as much as we don't want it, is also giving us a chance to hopefully make some permanent, lasting change in how we actually deal with the racial injustices that have been happening. So I think that is one part where I'm in some way grateful that the pandemic has happened, because it has forced a collective pause and a collective reckoning with our racist systems and roots.
Our organization is in a similar position to yours in terms of the education that we do. It's one of our main functions. We definitely have overlap there. I think actually that we're doing a training next week with teachers that's about emotional honesty in the classroom. I want to direct them to your resources, because we could definitely be doing some things together. But we had the same experience that when you're talking about access, we could see right away when COVID happened, which students did not have access to learning at all after they were locked down. Who didn't have technology, who got left out, learning support services, how was that going to happen? All of these things. And now we still don't really know what's happening with schools next month, right? A month from now is when schools will reopen. And it's a scary time. And related to that, in your work, which is raising global awareness, we have a situation where suddenly we're not welcome in most of the countries of the world. Mm-hmm. It is a time that I think it's more important than ever for students to understand what's happening around the world. Part of the insular nature of growing up in this region is maybe you're not even seeing yourself as part of the country, let alone part of the world. Mm-hmm. Again, it wasn't my experience, but I was around that experience. I grew up outside of the city and people didn't even come to Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. So, they were not going to be aware of themselves as global citizens, for example.
Right. And one of the challenges also that's been interesting to learn about in talking to other partners and community leaders is how when everything is normal, when everything, pre-COVID, day-to-day student life, if you are a student that needs to be pulled out of class for any reason, for an IEP, so if there's any performance or any other needs that you might have, or if you're an English language learner and you need to get pulled out to take ESL class, most often these students, at least in our region, are being pulled out of their social studies class, out of their civics class. So think about the importance of civics in becoming a future or current advocate and activist, and understanding the world and how you at any age can have a place in changing it. What our civil society is going to look like when a segment of the community just doesn't have that grounding. And I don't know what to attribute to this. There's many potentials. Coming from Florida, I am again proud of my roots, but sometimes disappointed in my state for a few reasons, including our educational system. And I don't know again what ties this has. Is it because I was pulled out of class to take ESL classes, or what is the reason? But there is so much about the Black American experience in this country that I did not know about until recent years. We just kind of gloss over it, hey, there was, Rosa Parks sat on the bus and Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement, and then freedom. No, and that is so problematic that to this day we tell a story of our own history in a way that is insincere and glossed over, putting it in the simplest of terms. So I think, again, this is where I'm really passionate of our work and how we create a more globally minded region by educating our young people, by bringing people together and really digging into our history, our current realities, and learning from it so that we can be advocates, so that we can bring forth whatever change we believe in. And we're all going to have different viewpoints and solutions and ideas around it. I don't, we're a nonpartisan organization, and that is important because we need to be able to have this conversation wherever you sit in your journey, in your experience, and what you view to be the best recommendation. But we need to have honest debates about it, and we need to be informed. And if at the most fundamental early levels, students are getting pulled out of an important part of their learning, which is learning about their history, learning about civics, that has a role. That, again, that's another one of these ripples that has lasting effects if it doesn't get stopped.
So, related to what you just said, the week after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, you posted a statement about your goals for the World Affairs Council and your commitment to being an anti-racist organization. And I read it and I immediately wanted to have this conversation with you because it was so well thought out. It has stages. I mean, it doesn't happen right away. Saying we're not racist is not the same as saying we are anti-racist. And there are so many challenges to reaching the goal that you laid out. But I wanted to hear about that. And so that was June 2nd. I looked it up because I remember thinking, wow, because it's hard to do that. And we're running, both of us, organizations where we have boards and we're also a nonpartisan organization. We have people of different political leanings. So tell me how you're doing that and how it's going and your thinking. Just if you can kind of walk us through how you arrived at that conviction and brought people along and where you are now.
So from my first moment as I was going through the interview process for the job, I spoke pretty openly and boldly with our board about what I thought were opportunities and who wasn't at the table currently. And again, no criticism to intent, right? Let's assume we all had the best of intentions, but the reality is that there's a huge segment of our population that doesn't know that the council exists, or doesn't know that there is a seat at the table for them, doesn't know that there are issues that they should care about, that we also care about, or that they care about, that we care about. And again, how do we take these big topics of world affairs and global issues and show that they're locally relevant, no matter what your zip code is? And how do we make them relevant to you is to understand you, to build a relationship with you. And all of that takes an honest awareness that who is currently at the table and who's missing. And let's name it, and let's recognize that when it comes to our Black and Brown communities, and including our immigrant communities, when it comes to the economic divide in our region, there's a lot of folks that aren't being included. And we know, I can tell you right away that the board was very receptive and said, we want to see, we want to be locally relevant. We want to see this change. And we recognize that there's more that can be done to really build relationships and partnerships and deepen that work. That I will say was taken to a next level by my predecessor, who was I'm not sure if Angelica was the first woman CEO of the council, but she certainly, I believe, was the first immigrant who ran the organization and did amazing work, and I admire her for that. So here we are with an opportunity of how do we go even deeper? How do we bring in our community, our Black and Brown community, our go outside of downtown, go outside of the spaces that we're typically in, and go into community spaces. Again, COVID and this movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the racial justice uprising turned up the dial on all of that. And it was a combination of all of these ingredients that caused us, and lots of open dialogue with the board, with community partners and others, where it just became clear we cannot we cannot say that we are globally minded or even aspire to be if we're not also anti-racist. You can't have one truly, authentically. You can't have globally mindedness without the other. And part of that is also what we were talking about in terms of the waves of migration. Pittsburgh is also very proud of its longer, deeper immigrant roots. And we know this when we're driving through Polish Hill and, Old Deutschtown and Little Italy. You hear it and you know it in these roots that have shaped Pittsburgh. There are other roots that also have shaped Pittsburgh that haven't been recognized, and that's in our Black American community's roots. We have a beautiful jazz history here. Mm-hmm. We have, obviously the history of the Hill District is so important and powerful, and it deserves even more attention than it gets. And then when you add to it the newer waves of immigrants to our region are predominantly Black and brown. So whether, however they may arrive, I'm proud of my Cuban roots specifically. It's funny when I left Miami that it's like, oh, you're Hispanic or you're Latina or you're Latinx. I was always, Cuban first and foremost. But people are going to put you in whatever box they want to try to put you in. And the same thing happens when you're a Black or brown immigrant. Whether you wanted it or not, you are inheriting the legacy of racism of our country. So this is an issue that affects all of us. And it just seemed like an obvious realization. And I don't know that I had the vocabulary to make that claim even a few months prior. So I think that's part of the point, is that we're all in this journey together. It's whether or not we want to open up our eyes and do the work, which means educating ourselves. And, I've picked up a lot of different books along the way. And one of the most, I think, relevant lessons is also this isn't a one and done. And we've talked about this a lot for years of work that corporations have been doing and wanting to attract and retain talent. And we want more, people of color and diverse teams. But they then do like one diversity training and expect it to be solved and for there to be this magic awakening that happens. And it's not. There's too much harm that's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years. And not just harm to communities that were the ones that were victimized and exploited and oppressed. It's also the harm that mirror that gets held back up to the perpetrators of this, and ways that there are, white supremacist systems that have been created as a result that affect all of us, that hurt all of us, especially those who are, especially the working class of any background. So I say all of this, and I even, stumble as I'm saying it now, because I think that's part of the point and part of why I made that post is this is a journey for all of us, and we need to be willing to be vulnerable and to be uncomfortable and to say the wrong things and acknowledge when you're saying the wrong things and step up and apologize if you're creating any harm. And hopefully I haven't done that with any of my language so far, but it is absolutely a journey. And I don't know where we'll be at the end of it, but I'm really, really hopeful that because of all of the ingredients at play and all that is forcing us to be present, that it will lead to change. I will say, though, we're not talking about Breonna Taylor as much, if at all, by comparison. And her killers have still not paid their price. So, yeah.
We had a conversation with Jesse Ramey and Amanda Nietrauer about the Gender Equity Report, and we talked a lot about, especially about Black women in Pittsburgh and how it's the worst place in the country, basically. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, we are also educating ourselves, and part of educating myself is recording these conversations so other people get to share in that education, which is so valuable. I see a parallel with your organization and our organization, because the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, we want people to learn about the Holocaust, and that's important, but we learn so much from the Holocaust. And if we want to stand up to the kind of cruelty and hatred, the genocide of the Holocaust, we have to recognize when things like that happen around us to other people. Mm-hmm. We have to, and I'm with you, the language is difficult. I'm sure that I've said things that are offensive that I never meant to be offensive. But that's also part of this, being willing to say the wrong thing. So I believe that you articulated the bravery that comes into just saying, this needs to get out there. I will say the wrong thing as often as I have to until I learn what the right thing is. Mm-hmm. And for the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, I've been head for 5 years, and for 4 of those years, we've worked with a lot of different communities. We've built a lot of relationships, always based on the principle that we're not doing drive-by programs. We're not doing one program. We want it to be much deeper than that. And that's a start, but it really is the beginning. And it, from my perspective, has to lead toward a different kind of leadership, different voices at the table, different mm-hmm. ideas. Everything that you're saying resonates so much. And I feel like, I'll be watching your journey closely because it's our journey too.
Exactly. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I would love to collaborate with the Holocaust Center. And I think there's so many other great organizations that if we can, pull together and again, build a bigger table to make sure that we're getting that representation, those views, that talent is here. We just saw with the special United Shades of America.
Shades of America, yeah.
So many wonderful folks from Pittsburgh on the premiere episode with W. Kamau Bell. And we have, whether it's Jaziri X of One Hood, Damon Young, who's a writer and just a wonderful human, Summer Lee, Wasi Muhammad, and others that were part of that episode telling the story of what's happening here. So I want to raise that to also say sometimes when we're talking about the pain and the harm, which needs to be talked about, we need to understand our history, and we need to do the work and not put it on Black and Brown communities to educate others and do the work for them. Mm-hmm. And we also need to celebrate Black joy and Black excellence, because that is another real, very important part of the story, that in spite of all of the harm, there's such amazing, resilient, beautiful humans and stories. John Lewis, who just passed, is obviously an amazing example of that. But we see it from young people to folks whose names we might not ever know at that scale, that are every day contributing to our community and making our worlds brighter in some way. And I think that sometimes what gets lost, and this would happen as well in like the immigrant inclusion space, where sometimes in an effort to talk about inclusion and to talk about equity and real gaps that exist within some of the members of that are directly affecting many members of the community, it can be tempting to talk about all that lacks and all that they don't have. But even those same individuals that might not have, like my mother didn't have the high school degree, or don't have the fancy titles or whatever resources are to be expected and deserved. But even in light of that, they're smart and successful and kind and generous, and there's our strengths there. So how can we be sure that while we're doing the learning and the work, we are also taking a strengths-based approach and recognizing the very real value that exists? because I think sometimes we can go down a path that when we only see the harm, we forget to see the human, and the human is much more complex. Yeah.
It's a fit with how we think about the Holocaust, and even my experience working in this area, which is now 20 plus years. In the early days, we talked a lot about victimization. We didn't talk about resilience. We didn't talk about the strength that it took for Holocaust survivors to rebuild their lives. We also didn't talk very much about the perpetrators. We didn't talk about, how people either actively participated or did nothing or said nothing, and how that was pretty close to being the same thing. There's so much that we understand because we've spent so much time learning about the Holocaust and how to teach about the Holocaust that is directly applicable to understanding this moment. And to seeing what you're talking about, seeing the strength and the beauty, not focusing on victimization, not focusing on negative things. This is a problem in how we hear about communities of color. We don't hear about the positive things. That doesn't get reported. That's actually part of the program that you mentioned. The part with One Hood was about media and reporting. And these are all things that we need to be aware of, even if we just see it and we recognize, I haven't heard anything good. I know good things are happening in our partner community in Hazelwood. I know that it's not all this very negative. Really.
Yeah.
And it's something to be attuned to. Yeah.
And this point on the perpetrator, I mean, that's right. So that's also when you think of white supremacy, intentionally or not, we are all, if you're not dismantling systems, you are upholding systems of white supremacy. And the point that Ibram X. Kendi makes in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, if you're not, you're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. And sometimes you can be both in the same day, because also becoming an anti-racist isn't a place of arrival. You plant your flag and you're done. You read the book and you're done. It is a constant journey because of the systems, because of the realities of what's been ingrained in us. So recognizing that we are all perpetrators, because we're not all anti-racist all of the time. So therefore, that means we are all contributing to racism, or have racist ideals or systems that we're a part of in some form or fashion. And until we actively do that work to become anti-racist and to keep that journey going and not pretend that there's a finish line, we are the perpetrators too. And that's incredibly difficult to I think admit for a lot of folks. I've had very difficult conversations with family members and with others who have a lot to say and a lot of guilt and fragility, some might say these days.
Yeah, I think, it's not necessarily that we made a choice to be perpetrators, but we made a choice not to recognize that there is a systemic problem here. We made a choice not to see the ways that we have benefited from this. Right. And many people make that choice every day still. And that's why this work is so hard.
Yeah. And I don't mean to equate it obviously with perpetrators of the Holocaust.
No, and I didn't take it that way. And I don't think anyone watching will take it that way. Although there's always one person, but we are part of a very problematic system in this country. And at least my experience growing up here was that we gave ourselves a pass because we're the North. Really. Yeah. So we were not thinking about how the system, and, if you're Jewish and there was a lot of systemic anti-Semitism for my immigrant great-grandparents and for their children, not allowed into this school or a quota here, or you can only rise so far in your company. And I mean, it was there and it was a real thing. So that's why I say it becomes more complicated when you include Jews who present as white, which in the United States, most of us do, but certainly there are Jews of color who are also often left out of the conversation and should not be. It's a little bit more complicated, I think, to say to another Jewish person, as pale as I am, you benefited from systemic racism. But I'm Jewish. And then you have to say, nevertheless.
Right.
And this was something that I could hold that as true without any discomfort until the shooting at the Tree of Life building. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, I have benefited from this racist structure in my country. And at the same time, someone would kill me for being Jewish.
Right.
Which to me makes it even more important that we're having these conversations and we're thinking about this. And in that program Sunday night in United Shades of America, the part in front of the Tree of Life building with Rabbi Myers, where clearly these two men had a real meeting of the minds, like a real emotionally honest moment. And I thought, we have the potential to do that. If we're opening our hearts, as we say, but also really listening and not being defensive. It's like being willing, as we started this conversation, talking about acknowledging our privilege, be open to that. It doesn't mean that we didn't struggle. It doesn't mean that we had everything handed to us.
Right.
But it means that there are systems that have helped us along or just haven't hurt us.
Right. That we might be benefiting from. Like I say, yes, I identify as a person of color, given my roots and my identity, but the reality is I'm white presenting. And again, I might still feel like that little girl who was finding her way through school and all of that. But the reality is I've worked in the mayor's office. I have these degrees, and what you personally maybe directly contribute to something doesn't mean that even if you did not directly contribute, did not intentionally oppress another. Again, look at the systems. I think that's what it always boils down to, or has become more and more clear for me. And which is why policy conversations and action and advocacy and understanding is so important, because it's until we recognize those systemic barriers that we will actually see change. And the problem is you try to have these conversations sometimes with some folks and it becomes so individualized. And on the one hand, it should be individualized because we have to take ownership at wherever we are in our world at the individual level. However, the change, or in addition to that, the change that we're looking for, if we truly want to be the type of society that we say that we want, then we have to change these systems. And you have to remove your whatever guilt you're feeling about it, and recognize that this is much bigger than you and your singular lifetime, and that this pain and harm not only has been there generations before, this isn't that long ago. When we're talking about slavery, when we're talking about, voting rights oppression, that still happens. So the remnants of it, it's not this faraway land in this faraway place. And even if you directly, as an individual, didn't contribute to it, weren't a slave owner, weren't directly oppressing the community in palpable, visible ways, it's kind of the point, is that we are all participating so long as we accept what's been the American norm as acceptable. Because when we peel back and look at our norms, they're fundamental. Their foundation is rooted in a system that is tied through and through to slavery, and therefore tied through and through to oppression. And we have to change that. And I think there's some lessons. I don't know if you would agree. I think there's some lessons in how Germany educates and learns and honors its place in the killing of so many millions, obviously of the Jewish community. And we have to take action, and we have a lot of change to do, and it's not going to happen. I do worry a little bit about the reality that it takes work. And I know I've said that a lot, do the work, and it takes work. And that means that it is an emotional toll on folks, but I've seen a lot of interesting comments, think about how hard it is for you and how exhausted you might feel in having to learn all of this and go through this awakening. Well, imagine how hard it is when this has been your life for generations. So I think that I worry about fatigue. I worry about folks wanting, we're not talking about the checkbox exercise anymore. We're talking about depth. But this is why it takes all of us. This is why we need to have that bigger table to keep holding each other accountable. And there's no room for complacency.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, the United States drove a lot of the denazification effort in Germany right after World War II. And I look at that, and it's exactly what didn't happen in this country after the Civil War. So, I mean, by 45, we knew what to do, but we hadn't figured it out for our own country yet. Mm. Are you hopeful now that there's an opportunity in this moment where we really could start to make some of these changes?
I am hopeful. I'm very hopeful. I hear it from friends who have long been doing the work, and I see that there is this moment that's built on a movement that has been a long time coming, and I'm hopeful. I think that the coming together of this crisis and the tragedies have created an opening for us to break through at a pace that we haven't been able to before, to challenge us in our thinking and our commitment to challenge us on who we want to be, who do we want to commit to, what type of society do we want to be, what type of a world do we want to be, and I'm hopeful that we're in uncharted territory and that we'll come out of it different. We need to seize the moment. We need to keep pushing, though. We can't stop. So as long as we don't stop and we keep pushing and learning and holding ourselves accountable and challenging our ways of thinking, I know that we'll get there. And I have to say, I think the young people are the ones that will hold us to it, mm-hmm. keep us honest. So they give me endless hope.
And it's the same for us at the center. There's something magical about working with students. There really is. And especially the students we're working with now. I mean, they have such a spirit of openness and determination. And I'm with you. That gives me a lot of hope too. And it's a blessing to be working with students and in education. And I look forward to working together. Really, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Is there anything we didn't get to that you wanted to tell us?
Let me stop and think. Yeah, I don't know what 2021 is going to look like yet, but we are turning 90 no matter what, and we are going to be celebrating all that means and our legacy that God has here today, and that we can look back on proudly, and where we're going to go for the next 90. And I am looking forward to celebrations, whether they are virtual or in person or a mix. Definitely hoping for lots of in-person hugs and greetings and activities, but really just a celebration of not just our work at the World Affairs Council, but of our entire community and the Pittsburgh that we've lived and the Pittsburgh that we want to be. So hope to have many invitations to share with you and get out there soon enough.
I look forward to it, and I really can't thank you enough. This was a really eye-opening and important conversation, and I can't wait to see what you do with World Affairs Council virtually and when we can be in person again. It's very exciting, and I want to keep that momentum behind global thinking in Pittsburgh. Well, we were already isolated. Now we're even more so because we're in our houses mostly, and I don't want us to lose sight of that. I mean, we are part of a much wider world.
Yeah, we need it. And I know in a past conversation, we had talked about the tendency that could come from a moment like this, the scapegoating, the fears, the isolationism, and that is all very real. And that is all something we all can play a role in countering and uplifting a different message, different opportunities that showcase that now more than ever, we need to be able to come together to recognize the value of everyone who has had different lived experiences, who look different than us, and really have more of an open arms approach rather than shrinking in any way.
Betty, thank you so much. It's great to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you. Thank you to the Holocaust Center for all that you do and for being a wonderful partner. Thank you so much.
It's our pleasure. And I mean, together we're going to get through this, and we'll fight on. We're going to make it a better place.
There you go. Thank you.